I'm Mace Rothenberg, Chief Medical Officer for Pfizer and co-chair of the Life Sciences Consortium of the CEO Roundtable on Cancer, the sponsor for today's webinar. As all of you know, FDA issued guidance for clinical trials in the setting of COVID-19 on March 20th and updated those most recently on April 16th. Oncology trials represent an important subset of clinical trials for several reasons. The serious and life-threatening nature of the disease, the fact that a clinical trial may represent the best or only option for some patients with few or no other therapeutic options, the use of therapies that require specialized expertise in administration, monitoring, and management of acute adverse events or hypersensitivity reactions, and the use of advanced technology or specialized processing of samples that cannot be easily performed outside of clinical trial sites. This webinar brings together key stakeholders from industry, academia, FDA, and the patient community. You'll hear about actions taken to minimize the threat of COVID-19 to study integrity. Importantly, you'll hear about approaches to the management of missing data. The problem that we all want to avoid is that despite our best efforts, the results from a given clinical trial turn out to be so incomplete or unreliable as to make them uninterpretable. We're fortunate to have more than a dozen colleagues from the FDA attending this webinar, and they are keenly interested in hearing about additional areas where further deliberation and guidance may be needed from the FDA. Today's webinar is comprised of 5 parts. We'll start off hearing from Paul Kluetz, our keynote speaker. We'll then hear from 5 panelists who will provide us with a broad range of perspectives on how they see COVID-19 impacting oncology clinical trials and measures they have taken to overcome these challenges. We will then move on to a moderated discussion with the panelists moderated by myself, Sean Kozin, who is who's Global Head of Data Strategy at Janssen, and David Reese, Head of R&D at Amgen and co-chair of the Life Sciences Consortium. We will then open it up to questions from you, which you can submit via the dialog box on your screen. We'll then close with remarks by Paul Kluetz and Dave Reese. A few housekeeping rules. The camera and audio functions for participants are disabled. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the dialog box. There will be polls conducted during the webinar, and you are encouraged to participate in those. And this webinar is being recorded, and replays will be available next week at ceoroundtable.org. I'd now like to introduce Paul Kluetz. Paul is a medical oncologist and deputy director of the Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA. His work has centered on clinical trial design and endpoint selection that best define clinical benefit and expedite drug development. Paul has a strong interest in advancing efforts to better integrate patient-reported outcomes, wearable technologies, and other methods to enhance our understanding of clinical benefit from the patient's perspective. Paul?
My job today is to talk a little bit broadly about the conduct in the setting of COVID-19 pandemic guidance that was put together with many centers at the FDA. I want to acknowledge the use of several of the slides from my colleague, Kara Al-Zarad from OMP, who has been integral in this guidance development. Today, I'd like to provide you an update broadly about what FDA has been doing related to COVID-19, and then really briefly introduce the guidance on conduct of clinical trials, focusing on a couple areas that I think are important so that we can listen in to the cancer clinical trial community and find out more about how you're able to operationalize these trials in these unprecedented times, and hopefully bring back some of this feedback that can perhaps even aid us in updating the guidance in the future. So we've done quite a bit with COVID-19 throughout the FDA. I think, as everyone knows, FDA regulates quite a broad range of products, and these guidances have spanned those, as I'll show you. We have granted emergency use authorization for many of the products that are really necessary to combat this virus, including ventilators and respiratory protective devices, diagnostic testing, and even some of the treatments. And we have actually been reviewing a significant number of pre-market IND submissions. These are generally going to CDER to antivirals, but also CBER as well. And I want to point out that the FDA Oncology Office and OCE has been working really closely with these folks, in some cases reviewing the IND submissions for products that are cancer products that are being repurposed. We are also conducting outreach and listening sessions in order to, again, bring back this information to update the guidance and really trying to convey to the public updated information as well. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of guidances that have been developed, and what's interesting about the guidance development process in a health emergency like this is we're able to not have the public comment period. So these guidances are coming out at a very rapid rate. Most people know that guidances can take months to years to create and release, and these have really been on the order of weeks. And as you can see, it spans quite a few of the different kinds of products and across centers throughout the FDA. But we will focus today on the conduct of clinical trials guidance. So this guidance was released initially on March 19th and has been since updated April 2nd as well as April 16th, again showing you that these updates have been occurring in a time frame of weeks. I'm sitting, as well as Pat Keegan is sitting on the working group, and it's been very instructive every evening to get together and listen to the questions that have come in and try to come up with important guidance for industry related to overcoming some of these challenges. The guiding principles for the guidance, I think, is the guiding principle for all of what we're doing across the healthcare spectrum, and that's to try to ensure that patients are safe. And that's paramount and is the center of what we're doing with these guidances and with these trials. The guidance, like all guidances, tries to provide context for broad questions that can be applicable across trial contexts, but we do know that there are specific questions, really related, contextual questions related to a trial where you would want to come to the division specifically and meet with them. So what are some of the main topics? What are some of the considerations that you'll see in this guidance? Again, it all starts with safety. We did want to point out very early that signal to sponsors that we understand this is a completely unique time. We are expecting protocol modifications. We are expecting that there will be protocol deviations. So we wanted to signal that we were aware of that and signal that we're willing to take a look at these modifications to try to improve patient safety and assure patient safety. To that end, big questions like whether or not to continue to accrue, whether to continue to administer drug to patients, and participate in trials should be brought up with IRBs and your independent ethics committee. Where the trials are ongoing, we are really trying to provide information about how to keep patients out of harm's way with respect to contracting the virus. And that means really thinking about alternative off-site methods for many of the ways we normally conduct business with trials, and using technology to facilitate how to collect this data remotely. There's been several areas where we've talked about alternative delivery methods for investigational products to the patient's home or nearby where they live to reduce their travel and exposure. An important part of the guidance is whether and how to report changes in trial conduct to the FDA, because we know that with a lot of modifications, there could be a lot of paperwork going back and forth, and we're trying to reduce that and increase efficiencies and focus on what's important. An obvious example here being COVID-19 screening. If it's implemented across the healthcare system, you don't need to report this as a protocol amendment if it's not part of the research objective, if it's not a COVID-19 therapeutic trial, for instance. The other part of the guidance that I think is very important is that while we do know that all of these modifications and protocol deviations may occur, you really want to be careful and document these COVID-19 contingency measures that you put into your trials carefully, and document even to the point of missing data and where you're having some data challenges. And I think that might come up today too. Now, I mentioned that every guidance is intended to be broad enough to be useful across contexts, but there are several times we think coming directly to the divisions would be important, and these are the aspects where either safety is really a real critical safety question, or where trial integrity is a major issue. So obviously, with respect to efficacy endpoints, where you're going to be changing or modifying how they're collected or how they're defined, that would be important to come to the division to talk about. And obviously, if they're failed to be collected, if there's some missing data issues, you should document that where it occurs. Another key consideration to come to the division for rather than not would be in situations where you would be changing your data management or statistical analysis plan. Obviously very important for the integrity of the trial and the ability for us to make conclusions. And so obviously if you're going to change an analysis, we need it to be pre-specified prior to locking the database. This is not an unusual request, and that would be a time to come to the division to speak with us. As I mentioned, I think this is a huge opportunity, and I want to thank the CEO Roundtable for putting this on for us because we have multiple FDA folks here that are in listening mode to understand. Now that you've seen the guidance, you've seen a couple of the amendments to the guidance, there are, I'm sure, are more challenges ahead, and we would like to hear how these are being operationalized from you and some of the things that you're seeing on the front lines. So again, with respect to alternative locations for safety assessments, these are just some of the things we're interested in. How is the delivery of these investigational products going, including IV products, which we've signaled could be done, but we'd like to see how it's actually being operationalized. Telehealth, digital health, virtual assessments, how these trials are being monitored with central and remote monitoring, and then methods to obtain informed consent, which can be obviously challenging in this setting. And then are there other challenges you're facing that are completely not touched yet with the guidance? We're very interested in hearing any of these issues. So in summary, our focus, as it always is and as yours is to remain focused on patient safety and make modifications that'll assure that. When we feel that the trial is safe to conduct and we're making these modifications, then we need to start thinking about how are we balancing flexibility with trial integrity and making sure, as Mace I think rightly pointed out, we have to make sure that if we conduct this trial fully, that we have the best chance of having high trial integrity to make sure that the data is something we can interpret and make a conclusion on. There is significant discussion throughout this guidance, and I'm sure throughout today, on efforts to use remote assessment and digital health technology tools to do so. And if there is a silver lining for this, it is that we are running a grand experiment regarding decentralized trials. We've been interested in this as a community, I think, for a long time, thinking it can show us efficiencies and actually be quite patient-friendly in moving trials out to where patients live. What can we learn? And finally, while the guidance, we hope, will reduce back and forth between sponsors needing to come to the FDA for questions that could otherwise be answered, we know that you should come to the review divisions for specific questions that relate to efficacy endpoints, major safety issues, changing statistical analysis plan, etc. So I see that I'm just about out of time, and I wanted to mention that on this slide deck that we're happy to share, there are many additional resources related to websites, links to all sorts of COVID-19 information across centers. And with that, I'll conclude, and I thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a great overview. So now I'd like to move to the second part of our session, and that is to introduce our 5 panelists, each of whom will have 4 minutes to present their perspective on how COVID-19 has impacted clinical trials from their situation and actions they've taken to meet this challenge. So I'll introduce the 5 that we have. We have Donna Smiley, who is the human resources specialist with background in academia and healthcare, who is now a clinical trial participant. Craig Tendler is head of oncology late phase development and global medical affairs at Janssen. Julie Lepin is vice president of oncology regulatory affairs at Amgen. Andrew Zimmer, director of data donation platform at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, and Kenan Natarajan, who's head of global biometrics and data management at Pfizer. Donna, let me ask you to kick things off. Please tell us a little about yourself and give us your perspective on how COVID-19 has affected clinical trials from your perspective.
Sure, thank you, Mace. As I said, my name is Donna Smiley. Most of my career has been in HR with medical practices, hospitals, and that sort, and then in academia. So my most recent job was HR director for a community college in Virginia. I'm no longer working because of the side effects and the complications from my therapies and treatments. In 2006, I was diagnosed with gastrointestinal stromal tumors, most commonly known as GIST. I had a surgery to remove the tumor, and I was fine for about 3 years. In 2009, the tumors resurfaced. I started on a medication called Gleevec. That worked well for about 7 years. And then in 2016, new growths appeared. So I had a liver resection, and I was fine for about a year. The tumors resurfaced again. So I went through radiation and several different medications that worked not so well for me. So I heard about a conference that was taking place at OHSU in Portland, Oregon, for just patients. So I attended the conference and I learned about clinical trials. And I learned that there was a phase 3 clinical trial starting at OHSU. So I met with the team there, got accepted into the trial, and that was in August 2018. Everything's been going well. The trial has been working. In March, when I went for my most recent visit, I talked to the team about what would happen should things change because of the pandemic. So we knew that we would possibly have to course correct and make some changes in order to move forward so that I could continue to participate and not miss any of my treatment. So what we're doing now is I have my blood work done. Any tests that I need to have done, I have them done locally. My medications are being shipped to me via courier. The only glitch that we've had is that the courier took too long to deliver. I had to have it from the research lab into my hands within 24 hours. The first time they shipped the medicine, that was a problem. So they figured out how to fix that problem. Now it's working well. But I know of 2 patients that were in clinical trials and had to travel the distance to get to their clinical site. Because of health reasons and other situations, they couldn't make that trip. So they had to drop out of the trial, which, if you look at today's situation and what we're doing to move forward so that people can continue to stay in the trials, if those things were in place back during the time that folks were participating in the trials, they could have continued to participate because they were benefiting, but they just couldn't continue because of travel. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned during this time, and I think we need to take the opportunity to figure out how to move forward in the future should something else, some other pandemic or whatever present itself, that we don't compromise the integrity of the trial and people who are benefiting don't have to drop out. Next, I think we have Craig Tindler, Dr. Craig Tindler, who is head of oncology of late phase development and global medical affairs for Janssen.
Thank you, Donna, and good afternoon, everyone. In my role, I'm responsible for the execution, oversight, and ultimately delivery of quality data that could support new indications for hematology oncology patients. And our teams are working very hard to maintain patient safety and ensure integrity of our clinical trials during this pandemic. I think for me, being part of this webinar today is not only useful for sharing our practices, but I'm very, very interested, like the attendees, learning about what other stakeholders are doing across the globe to try to meet this goal of maintaining clinical trial integrity. And as Paul said, paramount to all this is maintaining patient safety. One of the things that we've been surprised with is given the impact on the number of patients and sites and clinical trial personnel that have been impacted by COVID-19. It's quite remarkable, at least to us, that the impact on study conduct, in most cases, at least in our experience, has been manageable.
And I think that's really a testament to the outstanding efforts of investigators, research coordinators, study nurses, who have just done a humongous effort and heroic job of keeping patients on study and doing whatever's possible to ensure continuity of treatment visits and disease assessments. And for that, we are really eternally grateful. I'll just share with you in three buckets. First, managing patient safety, some of the things that we've been doing, and where I think we still have some work to be done. One is around trying to get ahead of the upcoming patient visits and the disease assessments. And so we use a prospective subject level tracking tool that helps us really anticipate upcoming visits over the next 3 months by site, by patient. And that tool allows us to begin interacting with site personnel to really determine, can that visit occur? Can that treatment be given? If not, can we find an alternative location to drop ship the drug? For oral medications, we have been drop shipping directly to patients. Obviously, for IV medications, that's much more challenging, but we're looking for alternative sites to be able to treat patients in case the hospital is not or the clinic is not a viable location. And we were able, in that type of tool, to not only capture the deviations, but also to put in the mitigations that were at least either actually utilized or suggested to address some of the challenges, again, to ensure continuity of the visit and the disease assessment. Sometimes that's offering other tools, like, as I said, local labs, or even the possibility of bringing in a visiting nurse, which and sometimes could work well. Other times, as you can imagine, there might be some patients that are reluctant to accept a visiting nurse into their home. We are working through some of those challenges. We're also looking to ease the burden on study sites with regard to, as I said, trying to direct patient shipments, direct shipments of study drug to patients or to other locations. And in some cases, trying to transition patients who have been on long-term follow-up with IV medications, and perhaps the study is already read out and they're still on their medication because it's benefiting them, and we're moving them over to other formulations, whether it be sub-Q or oral meds that can at least keep them on study, but importantly, being able to get them effective therapy so they don't have to drop off treatment. The second sort of bucket I'd like to touch upon is what we're doing on the data management side. And here we're trying to really address backlogs in data entry because sites are not able to keep up with data entry. Their focus is on treating patients, and often data entry becomes delayed. And so what we're trying to do there is offering modified contracts, implementing modified contracts very quickly to enable overtime compensation for site personnel to enter data off hours on weekends. And many of our sites have taken us up on that, as well as offering external resources to be made available. And again, that is a little bit of a touchy area because, again, some sites would be reluctant to use outside people, but often they're very, very happy to get support for overtime for data managers to enter the data on weekends and off hours. We're also limiting data queries at this point. Again, this is an area that I think many of the sites investigators, certainly do not want to be burdened with the volume of data queries we often generate. And so the only ones that are being issued now are the critical ones for patient safety and for that any queries that are critical for the primary endpoint, especially for studies that are approaching database lock. And the third area I'd like to touch upon very briefly is on the statistical modeling and mitigations that are being considered and in some cases already implemented to, again, as Paul has highlighted, to still be able to have an interpretable study at the completion. And this involves trying to model a certain percentage of patients that might drop off a certain percentage of patients that might have missed evaluations and what effect that might have on our power calculations. And using that, we can pre-specify some sensitivity analyses for the statistical analysis plan, as well as some alternative types of analyses and censoring rules that will then help us determine, do we need to enroll, for example, more patients to ensure that we have enough events at the end of the study to have an interpretable result? Do we have to modify the statistical analysis plan? What are the impacts on the time to event analyses? So that modeling is being done for every study as we try to then use that information in a way that will enable us to maintain the integrity of the study, modify the statistical analysis plan as needed, and often propose some alternative censoring rules. And many of this we envision will ultimately have to be discussed with our colleagues in the medical review teams at the FDA. So I'll close there. And again, I just want to thank everyone at the site level, for any of you who are on the phone, who are in the front lines helping us maintain the patients on study treatment. We really thank you for all those efforts, and we will continue to work with you in a collaborative fashion to ensure that the patient safety is paramount, but most importantly also that the clinical trial integrity at the end is maintained. Thank you very much. I'll now like to introduce Julie Lapin, who is the Vice President of Oncology Regulatory Affairs at Amgen. Thank you.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me. So I'm Julie Lapin, as introduced, and I work at Amgen, and I lead the team of regulatory affairs that support specifically the oncology portfolio that we have. I think what we're doing as a company is very similar to what Craig has outlined their undertaking, and the experiences in terms of adjusting patient studies, collection of data, monitoring, provision of IP are very similar. And on a patient-by-patient basis, we are tracking everything and every deviation that might occur in our protocols where those protocols are continuing. But what I thought I would do in my few minutes is just articulate not so much the practicalities around the study conduct, but more the regulatory consequences downstream or that are taking place right now. So just thinking of the activities my regulatory team are engaged in. I have to say, on behalf of Amgen, we were very appreciative of the rapid guidance provided by the FDA and the questions and answers, and very appreciative of the updates to that guidance, which reflect obviously the feedback that they've been receiving, and providing guidance for sponsors as we progress our studies. We found the guidance to be very pragmatic in terms of being offering opportunities for alternatives to collecting data, provision of IP, etc. And we're implementing as many activities as we deem appropriate to safeguard patient safety and continue the studies and ensure the integrity of the study and the integrity of the data to the extent possible. We've also appreciated that these changes can be done and implemented in discussions with investigators and with IRBs, and the paper burden hasn't increased yet to allow for these changes. So we are obviously monitoring every deviation, we're tracking everything in detail, and we're looking towards now what will constitute protocol amendments that will be necessary, and other ways to document the information, such as in clinical study reports when the time comes. I think it's fair to say for regulatory, in terms of submissions and interactions with the agencies, the bulk of the activity is yet to come. We're still grappling with understanding the implications of the changes to the study conduct, to understand what changes will necessitate protocol amendments, what can be documented in other means, and then obviously the later downstream consequences on the interpretability of the data when we receive it. can we still assess risk-benefit appropriately, particularly for new entities moving forward? And what implications might there be as a result of missing data on terms of label implications and post-marketing commitments perhaps in the future? So I think the regulatory discussions are going to continue for a very long time around the impact of COVID-19 on the conduct of our studies. As a global sponsor, another aspect that we're grappling with on an hourly basis is the disparity in some of the guidance around the globe. So we have at least 60 different guidances that have been released over the period of the last month or so. And they're not all, there are large topics which are very similar, but there's some very different nuances in the expectations of the regulators. And so when we're trying to grapple with patient by patient deviations and changes, we're having to look at all the guidance and make sure that in a particular country where that patient is, that we're grappling with their requirements as well. And whereas in the US, certain changes may be done without notification to the agency prospectively, in other countries, they can't. And so we're trying to balance that difference in regulatory requirements that are in place for the conduct of the studies and the expectations for protocol amendments and discussions with agencies before implementation. So from a global perspective, it's quite complex. And as I said, on an hourly basis, we're having to grapple with those disparities across the guidance. And I think, again, the bulk of the regulatory activities will come later when we then try to present these data to the various authorities and meet their expectations around these. There are examples of where changes can be implemented, such as provision of IP that we're speaking about, where we can drop ship direct to a patient, particularly for oral medicines. That can be done without notification in the US, but in other countries in Europe, for example, and it's disparate across Europe. There's not one approach in Europe. That's not always the case. And so there's an expectation of pre-discussion and pre-agreement before that. In other instances, what might be deemed as an accumulation of changes to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, these are going to be considered substantial amendments, and they have significant time associated with them for approval. And so the restart of studies that may be on pause is going to be significantly impacted, and we are looking to see what that will look like. And as I said, that's yet to come. I did notice in the pink sheet just this week, I think it was yesterday, in fact, that there are discussions across the regulatory authorities to try and harmonize might be the wrong word, but to reduce the level of disparities across the guidances that are in place. And certainly we're looking forward to seeing what the outcomes of those are, because we're trying very diligently to meet the needs of everyone, whilst being able to do things very quickly and rapidly and safeguard the interests of the patients. So that's perhaps where I'll leave it there in terms of the regulatory complexity that we'll need to manage. But once again, I'm very grateful with the FDA's very expeditious guidance and the Q&As that have been updated subsequently. They've been extremely helpful. So on that note, I'll end with my introduction from regulatory, and I will pass on to Andrew Zimmer, and he is the Director of Data Donation Platform for the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody so much for joining, and thanks for the organizers for the opportunity and the privilege to speak here. So I'll start with a little anecdote. I realized that since I'm not riding the subway every day, I could save a little money and splurge on something enjoyable, which for me was a subscription to The Economist, which I got the first issue of today. And I was delighted and inspired by an article from Bill Gates in the issue today, in which he said, over the next year, medical researchers will be among the most important people in the world. And that really kind of took my breath away. I think it underscores the importance and the urgency of every decision we all collectively make in the coming days, weeks, and months. So as Julie mentioned, I'm part of the data sciences platform at the Broad Institute. And over the last few years, we built a technology platform that we call Pepper. Pepper's reason for being is to connect patients and researchers online as part of a new paradigm of patient-partnered research that's easy to use, trusted, and secure. We've had the honor of working with a group called Count Me In, an amazing organization that's committed to accelerating cancer research. In many ways, the pandemic is dramatically accelerating trends that we've been seeing over the past few years in this space, with sample collection, data collection taking place at a distance from many medical centers. We've discovered that a great deal of high-quality information can be collected remotely through these studies: medical records, saliva, blood samples, even obtaining bank tissue at other clinics. I'm heartened by the success of these projects. I think that although there are differences between clinical trials, alternate endpoints, and general research, the overall willingness of participants to engage online is incredible, both here in the US and abroad, and it's really inspiring. I think now is the time to take the learnings from these experiences and apply them as broadly as possible to continue our efforts to improve the human condition. I'm really excited about the discussion today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kenan Natarajan, who is the head of Global Biometrics and Data Management at Pfizer.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me first thank the organizers for organizing this web conference and giving me the opportunity to be a panelist today. This is a very timely discussion as we face an unprecedented challenge, as Paul actually mentioned, and that we have never faced before. And it's critical for us to work together across industry, academia, and health authorities. The guidance documents put forward by the FDA, EMEA, and PMDA have all been very pragmatic in terms of managing patients in ongoing trials and enrolling new patients, and we appreciate this. And as Paul mentioned, I hope that this will lead to a new normal in the future. At first, we at Pfizer thank the patients and site personnel for their continuing efforts in support of the ongoing trials. Internally within Pfizer, we recognize the need for guidance documents that help support sites and study teams in a consistent manner across therapeutic area categories around the globe to maintain data flow and patient management during this time when sites are either closed or patients or study coordinators or study monitors not having access to the sites, broadly in line with the regulatory guidance documents. In terms of providing access to IP to patients, we have started shipping drugs directly to patients, including special cold chain provisions. For example, our liquid Xalkori for ALK-positive non-small cell lung cancer patients. In terms of injectables, we are working with sites on shipping supplies to the appropriate locations as instructed by the site, and we are following up with the sites to ensure the patients do get access to these medicines. In terms of study-mandated assessments of safety, we are encouraging sites to use telemedicine in all of our ongoing trials to follow up with patients to collect serious adverse events and other adverse events to avoid frequent unnecessary visits to the study site. Study monitors and clinicians are following up with calls to sites to remind them and follow up to get additional information as needed. In sites with active patients that are currently open and reporting that they are able to conduct the necessary procedures, study assessments for safety as well as efficacy are being performed during the on-site visits. The local institution safety labs are used in general practice in oncology. However, sites have been informed that new local labs can be added if it's deemed necessary during this COVID pandemic. On-site or local imaging facilities are also actually a common practice in oncology. However, again, new facilities may be added if deemed necessary to obtain CT or MRI scan required for the protocol. But in such a case, the investigator sites have been instructed to obtain a copy of the scan in a secure way, while the non-study site keeps the original scan result and all source documents. The study site performed the tumor assessments, enter the data into the case report form as required, and provide a copy of the scan to the central imaging vendor. Missed visits are being tracked. As Craig mentioned, actually, we're also tracking this on a patient-by-patient. And within 6 weeks into the pandemic, we have not seen a big difference in comparison to the past weeks. We are actively tracking scheduled visits for each trial using the windows for standard entry timeline up to 10 days, and we are flagging those that fall outside the window and are following up with the site. We're also offering any assistance in terms of additional resources to the sites for data entry if required. Data queries are being sorted out as critical and non-critical, and we are currently following up only with the critical queries to ensure that the sites are not being overwhelmed. And more importantly, risk-based monitoring that has been in place in Pfizer for the last 2 years have been a great help in supporting remote monitoring. There are, of course, challenges too, especially at the sites, ranging from lack of adequate resources, as I mentioned before, and to technology. We are considering several alternatives to perform effective source data review or verification, but it has been difficult to identify a uniform solution due to technology challenges or local privacy challenges in sharing data. We are looking into a short-term solution of engaging sites using web video teleconference to verify source data, but we are also investing in long-term solutions such as EMR, access to EMRs, and remote viewing via Vault. Lastly, we are also working in collaboration with other pharma companies, including those who are participating here, on statistical methods to assess the impact on efficacy and safety with missing data due to COVID-19. The Biometrics Leaders Consortium of the major pharma companies have met and provided a list of questions through pharma to the FDA, which resulted in the FDA guidance and as well as responses to those questions. Every week, a limited duration team of the pharma companies meet to share the guidance from each of our organizations. And also Pfizer is leading this across pharma limited duration team, which is working on statistical methods white paper, but across all categories, but it'll now be published in a peer-reviewed journal on how pharma is managing these ongoing trials. We have requested the FDA Biometrics Group and the EMEA Biometrics Group to write an accompanying editorial as well. And with that, thank you, and I now turn it back to Mace for the Q&A.
Well, thank you to all the speakers for giving really succinct, pithy presentations and exactly what we were looking for during this session. So now we'll switch into the third part of this webinar, and that will be short panel discussions. I'll be leading the first, and the topic on this is going to be managing patients on study. The second one will be led by Dave Reese. Will be talking about managing the data and missing data. And the third will be moderated by Sean Kozin, and he'll be focusing on interpretation of clinical trial results, also with missing data. So let me start out by asking you, Craig, about the administration of study medications, and also especially IV. And we know that a number of oncology medications now involve potentially toxic immunotherapy, cell-based therapies, et cetera, where there may be acute adverse events or hypersensitivity reactions. So tell me about what you're doing to ensure that the administration of those can be done in the same level of safety and oversight and accurate reporting and capturing of any adverse events that might occur during that process.
Yeah. It's obviously top of mind and something we worry about on a daily basis. So I think the first thing to say is we have to defer to the judgment of the investigator and the people who are caring for the patients. Sometimes they've made the decision to hold a treatment. Sometimes within certain disease areas, guidelines have already been issued to say, for example, in myeloma, defer the induction. We are a CAR T. We have a CAR T therapy in investigation for myeloma, and certainly understand that in many centers it's just not possible and probably not in the best interest of the patient at this point. But it's almost as if we were having on a patient-by-patient basis a discussion with investigators around the risk-benefit, and sometimes even under difficult situations, they're making the judgment that they want to go ahead, and we're supporting that. We're not global. We're not universally suspending enrollment or suspending treatment, but we are deferring to the judgment of the investigator and the site personnel whether they wish to continue or not, and we rely on their judgment in these difficult situations.
Another question is, we've kind of danced around a little bit, but cancer patients are also susceptible to getting SARS-CoV-2. So Ken, let me ask you, how will your approach be towards interpreting this? Individuals who may have certain illnesses, intercurrent illnesses, or whether it may introduce a certain delay or cause there to be certain missing assessments. How are you thinking about handling that in terms of the data that comes in?
So we intend to actually treat the same way as any active infections during the course of the trial. So we asked actually, we did a survey across all of our investigators around the world to try to understand how they would manage, particularly actually in this situation, and how they would even assess whether they will hold up treatment, and then actually when would they be restarting treatment. And the responses were very clear that each of these institutions will withhold treatment, just as we had expected as with an active infection. But again, restart once they are convinced that the patients have recovered. The issue is, again, of course, what they will define as recovery. Each of the institutions have their own institutional policy in terms of assessing what's considered to be recovery. And so we are now more leaning towards leaving up to the institutions to make the decision as to when the patient recovers from this active infection.
Very good. Donna, you mentioned that there are some people that you knew who had to discontinue the therapy they were receiving on clinical trials. What should those patients go on to do? Did they have alternatives that were available outside of the clinical trial?
Sure. I'm not sure if they did or not. I know one person that was on a trial that had to stop. She was trying to investigate other medications that she could take. Unfortunately, she passed away before she was able to find anything that worked for her. I'm not sure about the other person that was involved.
Okay. Cannon, you referred to something quickly, and I think it would be helpful for you to explain a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about risk-based assessments in terms of monitoring. Could you tell us more about that?
So yeah, the risk-based monitoring has been in place for a couple of years, more than a few years now. And also there have been actually ICH guidelines, and the FDA has also recommended actually using risk-based monitoring. The risk-based monitoring that we use is based on statistical algorithms that presets using a quality tolerance limit based on the data that is accruing. And based on those quality tolerance limits, it'll actually then recommend perhaps actually to reaching out to the site to actually say that there's potential quality issue and try to, and when monitoring was feasible, we usually send monitors to the site to actually understand what the data issue is about. But here, at least it gives us an opportunity to call the site personnel to understand what the quality issue is, and if it's maybe a data entry error issue, or if it's simply actually an issue that's transcribed incorrectly into the case report form. So those are the quality tolerance limits are going to be critical. They are pre-specified even before the start of the trial, and these risk-based monitoring has come to a great help in this situation.
Very good. Thank you.
Maybe if I could just add to that, one important parameter around that, and I'm sure in Pfizer you're using it too, is comparing adverse event reporting at a site as it compares to other sites, and then you're looking based upon these algorithms for outliers, and that really helps to really direct your attention very quickly in following up with sites that have gone maybe from regular routine reporting, and then all of a sudden you see it's dropped precipitously. And this type of tool that you're describing, the risk-based monitoring, really helped us intervene very quickly at a site level for that kind of event.
Very good. Okay, well, we've run out of time for that first panel discussion. I'd now like to turn it over to Dave Reese for the second panel discussion. Dave?
Thank you, Mace, and hello, everyone. I'm Dave Reese. I'm the Head of Research and Development at Amgen. And in this portion of the webinar, we will cover data management. I think we've heard a lot of valuable perspectives already on data management, collection, monitoring, and analysis of data. Perhaps I'd like to probe a little further on a couple aspects that may be new for us in the midst of the COVID-19 epidemic. Many of us believe that we've seen the acceleration of telemedicine perhaps by years or amplified because of the necessity of that alternative in the epidemic. And so I'm quite interested into how the panelists are actually incorporating this into their ongoing clinical trials. Perhaps I'd start with Donna and ask first, have you engaged in telemedicine as part of your experience? And second, what are your feelings about that in general, and then we can get input from Craig and Cannon on their approaches. So, Donna?
Yes. Yes, I've had one telemedicine visit so far, and it went just fine. The only thing I miss is being able to see the team in person, because I did enjoy the conversations we had, and they were more in depth, and I learned a lot. But the telemedicine conversation
Great, thank you. Craig, have you incorporated this into your ongoing studies?
Yes, on a sort of by-site basis. Again, this is very much dependent upon the comfort level and the willingness of site personnel to do this. But where it makes sense, we have been supporting those efforts and trying to use wearables or Bluetooth devices to, in fact, get some of the vital assessments, whether it be blood pressure, temperature, things like that, to be able to enhance sort of the telemedicine visit. And of course, making sure it's documented in the charts and that we have a record of those visits.
Great, thank you. And Cannon?
Yeah, we have actually put in place, including patient-reported outcomes that are actually being measured using devices that either the patient has or at least we have provided ePro devices. And in addition, one of the key things that thankfully actually the FDA recognized, and we had actually asked them to make sure that it's been clarified, is the case report forms currently actually as it's designed in the trial still stands, and we are not amending the case report form in order to collect these type of instances. Instead, actually, we are asking the sites to enter a common field in terms of how they actually obtain that information. And because originally actually the guidance had actually indicated that we should amend the case report forms, which would be a huge effort during the course of the trial and make that modification. So we're thankful actually the FDA listened to us and actually make sure that it's not modification where and when it's appropriate. So we're now using the common field to collect information if the sites are contacting the patients using telemedicine. So we're using a common field to actually assess whether they have been done actually using a telemedicine.
Great, thank you. So a very pragmatic approach. Well, one of the other things the epidemic has forced upon us is the necessity for ruthless prioritization in all of our activities. And one of those prioritizations that we may need to undertake is determining which data to collect. And one thing that I'm interested in hearing from the panel, perhaps I'll start with Julie and then also move again to Craig and Cannon here, is are you prioritizing, for example, primary endpoint data collection over secondary or exploratory endpoints, and what implications may that have for overall trial integrity, ultimately regulatory filing of packages if appropriate? So Julia, perhaps we can start with you on this one.
Julie or Julia? Julie. Thank you. Yes, actually, we have had to. We've had to, in certain instances, categorize absolutely essential elements that we need to collect. Much of that is associated with understanding the safety profile, and we've had to reduce priority around other aspects, or accept that these data will come later, such as for things maybe related to PK assessments. And it depends per study where we are in understanding of the asset on what gets prioritized. In terms of efficacy endpoints, particularly in oncology, which we're perhaps using a surrogate endpoint for, where scans are extremely important for us, we're doing everything we can to ensure that those scans get done. They might not be at the site that was initially intended. Any sites that we choose, more local to the patients so that they can get there, are being used. We're talking to the investigators about them and they're overseeing them, but the patients are not being obliged to travel long distances and go to their primary site. So we are trying to get those key primary efficacy assessments so that the integrity of the study overall is not completely jeopardized by all of this to the extent possible. I don't think we'll know until another month or so how much data we have been able to collect, and how much data is actually missing, and what impact that will have on our risk-benefit assessment overall, particularly for a new product coming through, where these studies are paramount in the understanding of that risk-benefit profile. And then obviously we'll have to dialogue with the agencies on how do we interpret these data, and are there downstream consequences in terms of labeling and post-marketing commitments to fill some gaps if it's even
Great.
possible.
Thank you, Julie. Well, I think we're out of time for this session. We can come back to this topic during the Q&A if others wish to weigh in. But now I'd like to turn things over to Sean Cozen for the third portion of the panel discussion, which will be on interpretation of clinical trial results, and in particular the issue of missing data. Sean?
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be here. I'm Sean Cozen, Global Head of Data Strategy for Janssen, Johnson & Johnson. We already heard about the complexities arising from data collection secondary to the COVID-19 crisis. And when it comes to interpreting the results of clinical trials, there are certainly new challenges that have been introduced due to the crisis. And in terms of interpreting the results of clinical trials, broadly speaking, one can categorize the challenges and the issues into two different subsets. One of the challenges is obviously due to missing data, the inability to collect protocol-specified data points, and patients are obviously missing certain critical visits. And we already heard about some statistical techniques that can be used to mitigate that, and we can dissect that out a little more during this discussion. Also, another factor that can contribute to challenges in interpretation of clinical trial results, more specific to safety, would be attribution. There is an expectation that there would be COVID-19 related adverse events, but also fatalities and deaths. Thinking about attribution and how to tease that out in the backdrop of the complexities of missing data is a very intricate and complex issue. So going back to the missing data as it relates to efficacy, even in randomized trials, especially in trials that are not stratified per region, according to, and in global studies, as we know, the impact and the prevalence of COVID-19 is very heterogeneous around the world. So it could introduce, even in randomized studies, informative censoring, and that's something that could be addressed potentially using statistical modeling. So I'd like to ask Kevin about some of the ways, some statistical methods that can be applied in cases where we may deal with informative censoring in a randomized study, specifically for time-to-event analyses, whether it's progression-free survival or overall survival.
So thanks, Sean. Actually, we are, as I said, actually, we're working with the Cross Pharma initiative to try to understand some of these impact in terms of missing data, particularly actually with tumor assessments. And one of the key things that we are focusing right now is to continue, as it's currently mentioned in the statistical analysis plan, and using the current guidance in terms of how progression or progression-free survival is actually being measured, including actually where you have two missing assessments, then the patient will be censored. However, we also are looking at, are there ways to actually to assess the impact or the amount of missingness, and then maybe we should look into other sensitivity analysis that looks into potential actually assessments beyond just those two missing assessments after the COVID-19 impact. So those are the key things that the teams are being actually looking at. Rather than taking a textbook approach, we have to actually to assess based on the accruing data to understand the impact. Right now, our first actually approach is to actually to put in more in terms of the current analysis as specified in the protocol and the analysis plan. and with the appropriate sensitivity analysis included in the analysis plan, amending the analysis plan prior to the database release to ensure those sensitivity analyses are included. With respect to overall survival, you bring up a good point with respect to this was another topic that was discussed, and the overarching consensus is that we should include COVID-19 related deaths in the primary endpoint, in the primary analysis. However, look at a sensitivity analysis of excluding those or censoring those as with the for COVID-19 related deaths, but more as a sensitivity analysis. But otherwise, the overall survival will include, just as any other infection death during the course of the conduct of the trial, these will be included in the overall survival analysis.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So it's clear that some of the statistical analysis plan would have to be modified. And Craig mentioned about some of the modeling that is being done to guide potential pre-specified sensitivity analyses that would need to be done, and some of these analyses will require a modification to the statistical analysis plan. Clearly, there is it's imperative to be in close communication with regulators. So, Julie, in terms of the guidance that the global regulatory authorities have distributed and have announced, do you see opportunities to have these discussions seamlessly globally with global regulators? And do you see discrepancies in some of the advice and the guidance that has been given coming from different global regulators, global regulatory authorities, specific to how to deal with protocol deviations and missing data?
Thank you, Sean. Indeed, yes, there are actually some discrepancies and differences in approach across the various guidances that have been presented in terms of how to handle any protocol deviations and changes in the conduct of the study that we've needed to undertake. One example that comes to mind, and believe me, we have a huge list trying to collect and compare all these guidances in the minutiae because we don't want to inadvertently find ourselves non-compliant. But one example is in Europe, remote data monitoring isn't really an acceptable practice, and whereas we're having to implement remote data monitoring during this period of time. And it's how do you grapple with that? That's a major and significant amendment that at the moment on the face of the guidance issued looks like it's unacceptable. I know there's still ongoing discussions around this, and I think there's lots of industries working with the trade associations have been dialoguing with other regulatory authorities to try and get more harmonization across the guidances. There are simple things such as the timing of which these protocol amendments, these cumulative amendments are needed. Belgium, for example, gives you a 4-month timeline from the implementation of changes. Well, in that 4-month window, we might not be quite ready to have a full cumulative assessment of the changes we've needed. And so we'll be informing one authority of one set of things, and then we'll have to revise that later, and it becomes disparate and just increases that burden. And as you go through, as I said, over 60 guidances, there are these little things that mean the diligence around how we assess changes and how we go about informing the agencies is heightened, and the paper burden is actually still there, not so much in the US, but around the rest of the world. It's still quite significant, and so we're grappling with that. And I mentioned earlier that some of these changes will be considered significant amendments in certain countries, and just the process of submitting those, waiting the months for them to be reviewed, and then it's just not tenable. So on a truly case by patient, country by country basis, we're having to assess, okay, what would this change look like? Can we do it? How can we do it? And do we need to pre-engage with the agencies? And so that's a very labor-intensive assessment that needs to take place.
Thank you, Julie. One last question.
I think we need to move on to the Q&A.
Oh, I believe
time is flying by.
Sure, I'd like to turn these over to Mace.
Thank you, Sean. We've got some great questions, and I want to make sure that we have a chance for those to be addressed by the panelists. So the first involves the use of technology. In times like this, it may be especially important to engage with patients so that they have clarity as to how their participation in clinical trials can continue. In addition, it's an opportunity for us to get information from patients in new and novel ways. So thinking about that two-way communication and the use of new technologies, just like to get your experience or your thoughts about what we are, what we can be doing. So Craig, let's start with you, and then Andrew, we'll go to you next.
So we've thought a lot about that, starting with even the electronic informed consent. And again, this brings up this issue of, disparate utilization in different regions. So we know, for example, that that's not something that's possible now in most European countries, that is not an acceptable way of getting consent. So it is this kind of, you always wonder, are you doing something in one place that could, somehow bias your patient, selection. But I think that's a tool, for example, that fits into that type of category of doing things differently, and something that we hope to get to in the future, and something that could really facilitate, entry into studies during these difficult times. But again, you can imagine once you start, the technology may be available, but there's so many other downstream type of sequelae or consequences that you have to manage, even as something as basic as contamination, during a pandemic, and people handling a tool that might be passed to others. So, I always just caution what sounds like something that could be very efficient and streamlined has to be very, very well thought out, because not all technology is going to be helpful during the time of this pandemic.
Yeah, I would echo those sentiments. A lot of our studies are online consent from the beginning in various places around the world. I think the communication piece of this is really key. Transitioning to a world where it's straightforward and simple and just sort of standard practice to have electronic communication back and forth between patients or participants and caregivers or people running projects and trials. Some of our studies just do this over regular email. Some of them do it on the phone. We have some projects that do additional, video conferencing and consent, and helping people walk through things that might not be apparent online or in writing to try to address disparities. But I think there is, as Craig sort of implied, I'm not going to put words into Craig's mouth, but there are a lot of fantastic technology options that are out there to do this, and we see them at play in regular websites. And it's a question of how do we make sure that none of that is going to introduce undue bias, and all of that is accessible and just generally available.
One thing's for sure, that some of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has forced us to consider are actually going to find their way into routine practice in clinical trials in the future and lead to more streamlined, efficient clinical trial execution. The next question actually is addressed to one of our FDA colleagues. If Pat Keegan could activate her camera and her microphone. The question is, the interactions that the agency has had with other regulatory agencies around the world in terms of sharing experiences, best practices, and in regard to a point that was raised earlier, attempts to try and coordinate requirements so that sponsors aren't faced with very discrepant expectations in different parts of the world. So I see Pat is joining us.
Yeah,
we can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry. There we go. Thanks. So actually, most of our recommendations at the moment have been based on just internally coordinating across centers and within FDA, and less of a coordination externally with the other regulatory bodies. And that's why I was particularly interested in some of the comments that were made about differences across regulatory agencies that are posing particular problems, which perhaps we should take back to the working group to say these are specific examples. To the extent that we may be more, I don't want to use the word liberal, but perhaps accommodating to certain methods, I'm not certain that FDA, will be able to make headway, but it certainly wouldn't preclude a conversation on that point. So I think having a good understanding of those aspects of mitigating missing data from the trial would be helpful for us to start that discussion. But we haven't had a formal and ongoing communication with the regulatory agencies. And so I think that having that list might help to jumpstart it.
And since we have you on the phone right now, the video, I'd like to have a question that's addressed by you and then Canon. And that is that intercurrent deaths that are caused by COVID-19. Now, as we heard, we encounter intercurrent illnesses all the time in clinical trials, and in some ways this will be handled in much the same way as those are. But not many of them have the risk of fatal outcome as COVID does today. So the question is posed is, will there be an analysis that is considered by FDA and other health authorities where clearly COVID-19 related deaths are excluded, and how that kind of analysis would compare in its robustness to an ITT analysis? So Pat, I'll throw it to you first, and then Canon, I'll give that to you.
Thanks. So I do think that an analysis performed as a sensitivity analysis would probably be a reasonable thing to discuss, but it should be done primarily on an individual trial basis with the review division. So most of our guidance is broad and lays out the general principles, but we can't give guidance that's going to be specific to every nuance of every clinical trial. So what I would suggest is that the proposal for those sensitivity analyses be specifically discussed with the review division, that who can probably give a more nuanced answer to the feedback. I think in general, any proposal for a sensitivity analysis that would be looking at that could probably be considered. It's very difficult to say how much more robust it would be or how robust it would be relative to an ITT analysis in any clinical setting. And I think a lot of it may depend upon, how one defines a COVID-related death, for instance, which has always been cause-specific mortality has always been very challenging.
Understood. Thank you. Kenneth?
So, Mace, actually, I concur with Pat. I think the primary analysis would always have to be the intent to treat that includes the COVID-19, and perhaps actually having a sensitivity analysis pre-specified in the analysis plan, and with an amendment to the analysis plan, working with the respective divisions to ensure that how to account for these COVID-19 related deaths. And this is pretty much a consensus also across the pharma industry, believe it or not. At least the biometrics heads across the pharma industry is also leaning towards the same, having as an intent to treat and focused on a sensitivity analysis and working with the respective divisions to ensure those sensitivity analyses are being included in their assessment as well.
Very good. And this is actually a question that comes from Paul for all of us, and that is, what's the most important clinical trial conduct issue that we feel needs clarity in the next FDA guidance? So let me go around to the different sponsors who are represented here. Actually, David, let me start with you.
Yeah, to me, probably how missing data will be handled. And one thing that hasn't come up yet that I think may be important in the discussion is that we may have significant geographic disparities in data collection, depending on the intensity of the epidemic and the timing of an epidemic in certain areas vis-a-vis the conduct of that actual trial in those areas. And we often, of course, in a regulatory filing package will do breakouts by geography or ethnic groups. Could that be potentially affected by the epidemic and potential missing data? So to me, that's at least one piece. And when I say missing data, it's a very, very large topic. And I actually mean to encompass almost everything you can think of under that topic. But to me, that's one that I would put near the top of the list.
Sean, what are your thoughts? You're on mute.
obviously the issue of missing data is important, and I think it would be helpful for the FDA to provide additional guidance on specific statistical techniques that can be used to address data missingness. Another thing that would be interesting to hear from the FDA, since FDA has a 360 view on what different sponsors are doing in terms of accommodating remote monitoring and data collection, and it would be great for the FDA to disseminate some of those learnings and what tools and technologies in broad categories have worked, and are there themes that we can incorporate into how we conduct clinical trials moving forward as best practices in the near future.
Kenan.
So one other thing that I would like to actually have the FDA weigh in on is the so-called period effect, because as you know, we want to actually to assess, and going back to actually what David talked about, the missing data and the impact of it, both on efficacy and safety. Maybe some guidance. There was actually a specific ask, particularly from the EMA, on the points to consider on assessing the period effect, which is prior to COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And each of us are going about doing it differently, and maybe actually I'd like to hear more clarity from the FDA in terms of how to actually to manage this. For example, in safety, we are assessing using an anchor date, and whether the anchor date is appropriate, but we can be doing it by country assessment as to when the prevalence of COVID was significant. Essentially, what we're doing it for Western countries, they're using a March 11th date, where we are assessing an anchor date. Anything that happened before, we consider it as pre-COVID, after is COVID, and then we'll figure out actually when the recovery is, where the March 11th date is when the WHO declares global pandemic. And in China specifically, the January 9th, when it was considered as a causal agent. So maybe more clarity on that aspect, actually, to make sure that it's more consistent with what the EMA is also looking at would be very helpful.
Okay. Great.
So one area I know that just comes up a lot for us is when can something be implemented at a site level in terms of capturing protocol deviations and documenting them as compared to when you need more of a global amendment. And again, we've been using our judgment there. I think the guidance has helped us in terms of obviously urgent safety measures, things like that to be implemented, without approval, without waiting for prior approval. But there are other sort of gray zones where I think, perhaps a little bit more guidance there would be helpful. But I do find that some people, naturally worry about, are we being out of compliance by only doing something at a site level instead of extending it across the water.
I think to try not cover the same topics that we've just heard in terms of suggestions, I think perhaps maybe further elaboration in the guidance on some practical aspects around how and when we should be submitting protocol amendments. I'm just thinking future state, when I look across our programs, we're going to have a lot of them coming probably around about the same time, all going to the agency. It's going to be a burden, and on top of that, there's obviously new assets and all the other responsibilities the agency have. So perhaps some further clarity and guidance around exactly what cases will require formal amendments and which ones could be covered in clinical study reports and submissions. Maybe even a rethink of what there might be. So to reduce that overall burden, obviously recognizing we need to document all of this as appropriate, but perhaps some more examples. I really like when I look at the Q&As to see the examples, and in this case you might want to consider X, and maybe some more of those so that we're not all of a sudden quarter 3, quarter 4 bombarding the agency with all these amendments.
Donna.
I think I'd just like to see that protocol changes or amendments are easier to implement, and I don't know what that entails on the side of the FDA, but if it would benefit the patient, not just during times like these, if it benefits the patient make it easier without hurting the integrity of the study to do those things so that patients benefit.
Very good, thank you. And Andrew?
Thanks. Because most of my world is research-based, I don't have a whole lot to add to this question, to be quite honest.
Okay, very good. One last question, and that is we're talking about the pre-COVID dates and during COVID, and hopefully we'll be talking about the post-COVID dates and how we kind of reconcile these three. But I'd be interested in understanding what people are doing to prepare for a potential second wave of COVID-19 that may occur in the fall or early winter. Are there any specific measures that you or your organization has taken to prepare yourself so that if that does occur, clinical research can go on? Open up to anyone who has some thoughts or insights onto this.
So, Mace, I can start off with actually, as I said, one of the key things that we are investing now more is that, as Paul alluded to, we have to think about the new normal and not just forget actually the things that we're doing now and try to, after the post-COVID, and get back to the same normal way of, or past normal way of doing things. And one of the elements that we are investing heavily now is source data verification or source data review. Collecting that information more in an effective way and working with the sites and building on the technology aspect of it. So in that way, we don't send monitors to actually to have those, instead finding ways of maybe accessing the electronic health records or working with the sites to create a vault where they can put some of those records so that we can actually access those in a more effective manner. So this helps in removing more the monitoring aspect the way that it's currently done today.
Very good.
I have something I can respond on this, and that is, so the Broad Institute has a very large sequencing facility, and as part of our COVID shutdown plan, we actually converted a lot of that sequencing facility into a COVID test facility, and it's scaling up and doing a lot of testing in Massachusetts. So I think that will keep going. We're involved in a lot of research to start doing, surveillance is a bit of a dirty word to me in general, so it's kind of hard to apply that to disease monitoring, but generally the idea of being prepared, building up capacity to keep track of the prevalence, to keep track of the outbreaks, building up research projects, working with IRBs to make sure that we can conduct that research immediately so that if there's a second or third or whatever wave, we'll have a better system in place for responding to it faster.
Good.
Yeah.
Mace, I have one comment there as well. So one of the areas where we are seeing a big impact is in the reduction of screening biomarkers. So we are trying to work with some of our genomic providers and labs to see if there's some opportunity there to streamline that process. Obviously, for many of our partners, that's a big impact. And then just one other comment, I think, to the point made about, using this opportunity to change the way we do work going forward. One thing that we've talked about really now begin to eliminate the on-site initiation. But I think going forward, and whether there's a recurrence of the virus or not, we're really looking to replace all the site initiation now, which would be a big formal thing. Many people having to be scheduled at the meeting room 4 hours. We're looking at this as a way of eliminating that, and creating more of a remote and a compliant way.
Very good. All right. Well, now I'd like to transition to the final portion of the program, and that's closing remarks. I'll turn it over to Paul Kluetz and David Reese.
Thanks, David. And thanks, Mace, and thanks to the CEO Roundtable on Cancer for having us. This was really instructive, very interesting. I heard a lot of recurrent themes, and they were themes that we're thinking about. I guess one of the take-homes is what Pat's question was where there is international regulatory differences, is there any way that we can help streamline some of those? And it's more than just this situation, obviously. We would all like to see global clinical trials conducted in the most efficient way possible. So we have a couple programs in the Oncology Center of Excellence looking to interact more with international global regulators, and this is just one more way to do so. I guess just to end, I would echo and maybe mention Mace's point. What are we going to learn? How are we going to handle the next wave of either this or any other major international trial disruption? And I think we will be more ready based on this and based on things that we're learning, as I've just heard. And I guess I'm happy to hear from Donna that her telemedicine experience was a positive one, because in the end, it's all about making sure that patients are safe and that these trials are moving out to where patients are. It can help eligibility. It can help accrual. And I sincerely hope that we can, instead of copy pasting what we have done in the past, use this as a way to improve what we do in the future in a safe way where trial integrity is maintained. So we will take back all this feedback, and we really appreciate the opportunity to join you all.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. And I'd like to thank everyone who participated today, our colleagues from the FDA, academia, industry, and from the patient community. We've heard a number of very important themes across the day, ranging from challenges from the patient perspective to compliance with a variety of global guidances to the nitty-gritty of trial conduct and attempting to maintain trial integrity. I'd like to harken back to some words that Paul used in his introduction, which is that we're in the middle of a grand experiment. And I think that that's a very nice way to characterize what we're doing. But what we don't know yet is the result of that experiment. What are the conclusions of the experiment? And as you've heard throughout the panel, I believe it's incumbent on all of us to really ask fundamental, bone marrow deep questions as we go forward of what should we change permanently? What are we now doing out of habit? Craig just mentioned on-site site initiations. It's very clear to us as well that that's archaic, medieval in many ways, and is an area for efficiency. Just one tiny example among many, but there are many things that we can learn, that we must learn from this experiment. And so perhaps that will be the focus of another symposium sponsored by the CEO Roundtable on Cancer. For now, again, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of the participants and wish you a good afternoon and a good weekend. Thank you.